Fabulous. And remember, if you don't consent to being live streamed, make sure you type that in the chat before your speech if you change your mind at a later point. Without any further ado, on the motion that as the Putin administration, we would choose to artificially decrease Russia's oil price, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to begin today's debate. Hear, hear.
All right. Just want to make sure that I'm heard. Okay, since I see the nod. This debate is not a debate about what is best for the entire world and what provides peace. This debate is where we consider we are consultants of the Putin administration and analyze what is more strategic for Russia and Vladimir Putin's place in this world. We think that there are two types of goals that we want to put in this debate. Number one, where do we prevent Saudi Arabia and United States alliance to dominate? But secondly, where do we keep Russia's interest at hand? And where is Russia's oil industry the strongest? And where is the soft power of Russia going to be more available at the end? What is the model that we want to happen in this debate? So we want to withdraw from the agreement that we had in March. We want to oppose OPEC and be an autonomous type of country and say, I will artificially decrease Russia's oil price or increase its price however I want. We want to characterize oil first when it comes to Russia before everything else, right? Because we think oil is a major product of Russia in terms of their petroleum reserves. We think that oil is the major export coming from Russia. With that, I will talk about three arguments in today's debate. First, I'm going to be talking about why doing that now, opposing OPEC, is the most strategic time more than ever. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about why Russia is better off following its own rules to prevent the dominance of Saudi Arabia and America. But lastly, where Russia can help the rest of the world and gain more soft power at the end. Let's go on to my first case. Why is now a strategic time? We think that there are three structural reasons. The first is that today we are in a global crisis, which means that this is an opportunity for the Putin administration to do what it wants. Why is this so? Because there are fewer conferences happening within the global community. Different countries have different priorities, and international coverage will be less due to the current pandemic and coronavirus. That's why we think it's sneaky right now for the Putin administration to actually withdraw from OPEC and impose its own rules to itself. But second structural reason is Russia's population doesn't really care about like international rules or like being like okay with like international organizations. They actually celebrate that in Moscow at the end of the day as showing that we are the global power. But thirdly, we think the international community doesn't have enough leverage against Russia in the first place, regardless if it's a global pandemic right now. What are we talking about? What are these examples? We're talking about the annexation of Crimea. We're talking about NATO going against Russia. We're talking about Putin hacking the elections in Russia. We're talking about Russia hacking America's elections. What does this mean? When you're in the Putin administration, right now is the most strategic time to actually do so, where you're the most powerful and many countries are its weakest. What is the impact? Putin will able to oppose OPEC with ease and grace without much media attention, but gives US and Saudi Arabia a harder time to actually dominate globally with their economy. What is the comparative? In opening government, we have the best timing in terms of to preserve your own particular industry and also your best interests. But what happens in opening opposition side is that they are constrained within OPEC's regulations, meaning that they don't have flexible strategies on what's best for your economy. Their sovereignty is infringed, and there's actually no natural incentive to be part of OPEC at the end of the day, rather than just like feeling good that you're respecting these types of laws and agreements. What is the second case that we want to talk about? We want to talk about the dominance of Saudi Arabia and America in OPEC. Because our first assertion in this case is that Russia is better off following its own rules. Three structural reasons why. First is Saudi Arabia and United States of America doesn't carry the best interest of Russia in the first place. But secondly, America is in direct competition of Russia even now. But lastly, rules in OPEC doesn't really accommodate the interests of Russia. What is the main example that we'd like to flag down? In 2003, Russia discovered new petroleum resources and has been discovered. But they were forced not to sell it and to add it in the GDP during 2003 because there were OPEC regulations at the end of the day. What is the impact coming from here? Is that you let America and Saudi Arabia dictate your economic policies at the end that may not be convenient or good for you, which would lead me to the third argument. But before that, I will take a POI from IIUM or IRTSA.
Okay, currently, who is buying Russia's petroleum?
So Russia has different options in terms of where to sell it. So we think that Russia's oil is being sold all across the globe at the end of the day, and different companies can create those private agreements at the end. Let me go on to my last and really important argument. Where can Russia help the rest of the world and gain more soft power? So this type of agreement in the OPEC was made during March at the end. But recently, we have new circumstances where the global pandemic is actually worse, where people can't leave. What does this mean? It's actually strategic for oil-producing companies to cheapen oil prices when many people all around the globe has lost their jobs and lost their opportunity to create income. Why is this good? This is good because this increases Russia's capability to help like less developed countries and especially countries that are affected by that global pandemic. So we think the benefit coming from the Putin's administration is that it gains more soft power and legitimacy. So not only does it only attack the dominance of Saudi Arabia and America, but Russia has a better foothold in this particular types of agreements because now they can uniquely contribute to a way where it's actually rational for people to spend on cheaper oil at this point in time. What happens in opening opposition? If we're talking about like where do we best protect the world, what happens in opening opposition is that they get stuck with having high prices at the end of the day. That means that their people, their citizens all around the world, not only in Russia, will suffer from this economy at the end of the day because oil prices are too high. And who only like benefits from here? Middle Eastern countries and like Saudi Arabia and America benefits from this type of agreement at the end of the day. Why is that so? Because America and Saudi Arabia are the two most largest creators of oil or the ones that extracts oil, and they still are the priority of the rest of the world. So we think this is actually strategic for Russia if they take away from the particular agreement and create strategies of their own such that they can better their foreign policy, but also better their own economy within that particular country. We didn't say that we're going to be talking about what's best for the world, but in terms of what's best for Putin, we think that Putin should hire us as his consultants. We are very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open the opposition bench case.
Hello, can I be heard? All right, I'm going to start now. The clash for opening opposition is simple. We want to follow the agreement and want to engage in higher prices in order to make sure we don't break it and do not engage in a price war. I want to make two contextual clarifications before I move on to the rest of the speech. Other rebuttals will be integrated. The first thing I want to point out is this first stance that says, we don't care about other people in the world and we think it's about Putin's Russia, but at the same time says that other people in the world will not be alleviated from suffering, the point at which we are able to do this policy. The first thing I want to note is that even if there's a degree of beneficiary and soft power for Russia, I don't think it's random developing countries that Russia wants. Actually, a lot of the time, I'd say it is their ability to ensure that border countries, former Soviet states, are able to ally with them much, much better. I'm going to prove why a lot of the domestic policies later in this speech and things like your military might are strengthened by the increase in oil prices. The second thing I want to point out is this mischaracterization of OPEC. They say there's a US-Saudi alliance and therefore US-Saudi control OPEC. In fact, OPEC was created, and it's not as simple as that alliance existing, to be able to counter a lot of the dominance in things like the US ability to have dictation of prices, their agreements amongst each other, and therefore it's not simply, now the US has control over our economy and therefore that's harmful. In fact, and that's the first thing I'm going to do with this argument, I will display that this is a prime opportunity to leverage an economic crisis against America. We have to make sure that the West, that the EU, that the US all bleed out in this particular point in time. So the first thing I want to characterize here is that we're undergoing a global recession due to coronavirus and the inability of states to be able to afford many things because they're spending a lot more on things like stimulus. The second thing I want to point out is there's a constant demand for oil. It is the basic necessity of things like being able to transport through your economy, fuel, etc., etc. The last thing I want to point out here is that an opening government, when you decrease prices, what we say is that with the little capital you have, you are able to ensure that they can still afford things like Russian oil and be able to pump their economy. I think what we want to do is the opposite. We want to cause stagflation. We want to make sure that you have little capital and have very, very few things to be able to afford with it, such that we sow distrust in a lot of European governments and the US state in their inability to be able to deal with us. I think this has two ways that this benefits Russia. The first is the short-term leveraging power. The first thing to point out here is that a lot of the military stances, like a lot of the things characterized coming from opening government, the annexation of Crimea, Georgia, and the ability for us to enter a lot of these things, are simply less likely to happen when the US has to spend much more money on oil, the point in which they have to probably or have less justification in trying to do things like defend the border around Syria, have less justification in trying to enter the Middle East, because that's a lot of military expenditure that could have instead gone to things like welfare. No, thank you. The second thing is a lot of countries desperate for this kind of oil then have to be able to negotiate with us, beg for it, and that ensures a lot of ability for us to be able to, leverage a lot of our negotiations against them. The last thing I point out here is just long-term benefits for Russia here. A lot of the narratives that they're able to sell, a lot of the distrust they're able to sow are through showing that democracy, showing that the American economy, showing that the inability for the EU in its current state to be able to prosper is precisely because of it. And you can't display that if they can dutifully recover from this coronavirus. You need to make them bleed and suffer. And I think what that uniquely does is it ensures that future states must want to ally with Russia a lot more, or this wave of populism is far more likely to become popular because current and traditional states that are not being able to employ it, that, precisely because populism feeds off poverty, are going to ensue. And I think these are precisely the kinds of states that are much more likely to ally with Russia because of things like their more authoritarian nature, because of things like wanting to ensure that you don't have to always protect freedom and democracy or intervene in states that need it most. And therefore, that's a benefit for Russia. Secondly, I'll talk about how this harms relations with OPEC. So OD says Russia should follow its own rules. It's the prime time to do this. I don't know why that's true, right? So I don't know why we should suddenly go off on tangent and break the history of the OPEC relationship. And I'm going to prove why. The first thing I'd like to point out is that Russia is not the strongest driver and actor in this debate. So even if we can engage in a price war, now, one, you've shown that Saudi Arabia has already previously had the ability to respond. So it's not even that you can benefit off being the lowest priced oil in the world anymore, or show that you have the comparative capacity for that. But secondly, I would like to point out that this OPEC is built precisely on trust and the ability for the mutual agreement of these nations. Once you break that trust, I think it is much harder in the future for Russia, the point in which they may want to increase prices themselves, the point in which they want to be able to act on their own and want to negotiate with these states to help them do so, is incredibly much more difficult. And I'll point out why it's the opposite of prime time to do this. I think Saudi Arabia's initial goals now with Mohammed bin Salman, slightly delayed by the coronavirus, but will happen and slowly happening, to the increased diversification of their economy, is trying to move away from oil. And that means the massive dependence, the massive economic hits are less likely to exist in the future. So even if there's a short-term benefit to going your own way now, the Russian economy does not want to diversify. It does the opposite, precisely because a lot of Russian oligarchs who keep Putin in power own a lot of Russian corporations, and therefore you don't want to lose your strongest cronies by saying, let's have liberalization, diversification, etc. Crude oil will always be the primary product of Russia, and the inability for you to negotiate with the strongest producers of it when they are moving away from it and therefore will have greater capacity to say, I'm less dependent on it, you are more dependent on it, we can punish you for the actions you took in 2020, are much more likely to be damaging to the future stability of Russia then. Lastly, this is bad for Putin's domestic intentions. I think OG is clear in pointing out that oil is Russia's main export, but you can't evaluate the Russian economy as you would normally evaluate an economy in terms of growth, etc., etc. In fact, the primary economic interest of Putin is to appease a lot of his oligarchs that keep him in power to be able to do things like fund government projects, like fund the military, like have cheaper oil, etc. These are primarily the reasons that Russia can exert a lot of military force, can do things like silence and oppress people when they are in the time of protest, election, and be able to hijack all of these things. Because you have particularly powerful allies rather than rely on the hands of democracy. I'd say you lose this, right? This is a bad economic decision. You're lowering prices for them when the constant or the demand for oil is relatively or at least incredibly high at almost all points in time, even during a crisis, and therefore limits their ability to gain profit. I think the inability then of Putin to be able to garner greater cooperation from particularly powerful people in Russia harms his domestic interests. At the same time, I think the public, who were generally okay, not generally okay, but at least did not actively riot because of fear of the military, because of things like, them having a relatively stable, even if not perfect economy, is hard now. Compound that with the coronavirus, that means they're simply unable to be able to provide things like basic needs, have more difficulty doing things like stimulus because they can't get the initial revenue for it. Just means for the most public, for the most powerful, Russia dies. I'm very proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the Leader of the Opposition for that speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the case for the government bench.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Yes? Perfect. Okay. All right. Our time starts now. OO's case was contradictory at best and unpersuasive at its fundamental worst, right? So first of all, they tell us that, Russia doesn't care about using its soft power to help other countries. It's more focused on bordering nations. We think that yeah, sure, to the extent that that's true, having more economic power and having more control over your oil allows you to have better relations with your neighboring countries. And so we think we get to access that benefit. So what do they tell us in our case? They tell us, first of all, we want to use the crisis in a different way, right? They tell us that states have less budgets, but there's still a constant demand of oil. This is the exact reason why you should support our policy, because at the point in time we are in right now, states are desperate in order to be able to save money. For all the reasons OO gave us, states are less willing to negotiate, less able to negotiate, because they just have less leverage. They have less funds available. Their populace is demanding that they keep the countries running. And this is crucial to their continued integrity of the people in those governments. And so because of all the reasons OO gave us, they are more likely to buy our cheap oil. They're more likely to come to Russia over more expensive oil because we've artificially decreased the oil, right? And then they move into something that's wholly contradictory, right? They're oh, we want to cause stagflation. We want to increase the amount of money so that the US has to spend more money on oil. We think that Putin would never do this because Putin knows that you have a unique strategic advantage with a Trump administration. Trump's a fucking idiot, but Trump loves Russia in a way that no other US presidents have loved before. And the reason why Trump does so is because Trump has genuinely believed Putin in their interpersonal meetings when Putin has told him that he really has America's interests at heart. And so if you radically increase oil prices, you lose the opportunity to keep having Trump as this trusted advisor who's going to continue to do things in your interest, because Trump will feel betrayed. Oh no, Russia's not really in my interest. And so when you have this unique ability to manipulate the president of the most global power in the world, you would never do something that would directly alienate him by infringing on the promise that you directly made to Trump. But secondly, and more importantly, right, it just won't work at a macro level. We increase our prices and then we're higher than Saudi Arabia. All the desperate countries, like I said, and for the reasons why OO said, well, now just go to Saudi Arabia, which is going to screw over Russia, and you'll be completely shut out from the process, which is not in the interests of Russia. Lastly, they're acknowledging that, we'll increase prices to cause stagnation, knifes the rest of their benefits, because artificially increasing prices to the extent at which they want to cause stagflation also isn't following Saudi Arabia. It's not obeying OPEC's rules. which means that they lose all the benefits of allyship that they've talked about elsewhere, right? So I'm a little bit confused about if they want to follow the policy or if they want to like radically increase prices and cause stagnation in a way that like would benefit Russia, because it's a little bit contradictory there. Now, then they want to talk about why it's not strategic now in the crisis, right? They said, Saudi Arabia can totally keep up with Russia. One, this is empirically wrong because they told us in the motion that that's not the case. So over the long haul, Russia will definitely be able to beat Saudi Arabia if it does this. Secondly, I'll give you an additional reason, which is Russia just has larger stores of oil than Saudi Arabia, especially like Bolo told you, we recently developed large swaths of it. We have the resources to win out over Saudi Arabia in the long game. And then thirdly, gives us the reason why we have to do it now. It tells us that Saudi Arabia is in the process of diversifying and that in the future, we won't be able to chokehold them with oil anymore. This is the exact reason why it is most strategic to do so right now, meaning that the longer you wait, the marginal benefits of being able to do so are lost. And so if you are following what's most strategically in the interests of Putin and Russia, you would do so now before Saudi Arabia diversifies too much. And then they said, we will have less negotiation with Saudi Arabia if we pass this policy, without giving us the reasons of one, why we need negotiations with them. If we can drop our oil prices, beat out Saudi Arabia in the long game, dominate the oil market, prey on all the desperate countries in the coronavirus crisis, we don't need Saudi Arabia's help or allyship. And secondly, right, it doesn't matter if we lose allyship like Saudi Arabia, it doesn't harm the stability of Russia, right? For the reasons that I'll dive into now, right? So this crisis is a huge opportunity for Russia. There's going to be very little consequences from it, like Bolo already told you. There's going to be less international coverage because it's all swamped by like coronavirus headlines. No one's going to care about Russia withdrawing from like this oil agreement that the average person doesn't even care about. And secondly, there's just less effective diplomacy. Like people aren't able to have conferences and meet, like Bolo said, which means that like other countries can coalesce less effectively and they're less able to unite against Russia. This is also strategic to do it right now because of maximum returns. Because other countries are desperate, we can prey on them. They have less leverage. And ultimately, like even countries that you don't have as much leverage over for any reasons that OO wants to come up with, countries are still distracted right now. Their attention is diverted between like the rising global recession in their own country. They're less effective at responding to Russia now more than ever because of the coronavirus crisis, right? And so because of coronavirus, this is a perfect way for Russia to improve things internally as well. And so this is some new content I'm bringing you, is one, Russia GDP is also in a recession. Russia is also being hit by quarantine, which means that the trading of like economic progress for personal rights that countries like authoritarian countries like Russia or China lose their focus during a crisis like this. Civilians are less willing to put up with authoritarianship and like surveillance and loss of personal rights when they're not having economic development. So Russia has to make a move in order to radically increase the economic progress or the economic stagnation that is seen internally from this crisis, or else citizens will start to get upset with the government and they'll start to become anti-government, right? Secondly, we think that there's also a political crisis that's been rising in Russia over the last year that it's better able to solve right now, right? You've seen the rise of anti-Putin opposition parties in Russia over the last year. You have like pro-democratic parties that are having more and more persuasion with the general public. You have political competitors even within Putin's party who are making moves to try and coalesce against him. And so using economic development by capitalizing in time of crisis creates a unique tool for Putin to weaponize in terms of increasing and stoking the flames of nationalism within his own country. And if he's able to get people to come together about, wow, Russia is so powerful right now, Russia is flexing on the rest of the world, it means that they will continue to support Putin disproportionately more than they would any other parties that are threatening Putin. So not only is it in Russia's overall interest to do this, it's also in Putin's interest to do this, which is what I'm telling you here, that when you know that you continue to have authoritarian rule, you know that the length of your rule means that over time, you know, opposition parties will always arise. This is a natural thing. This is a perfect strategic opportunity to crack down on opposition parties in a severe enough way by increasing the nationalism that you have around the act that you as leader are taking versus anything that they are proposing or would propose. And so this gives you the long-term benefits of for the next decade, or for the next 2 decades, having increased weaponization of nationalism around this act in order to be able to keep opposition parties at bay. Why do we win this debate? We've told you that Russia it's in its interest to do so. It's in its interest to capitalize on the coronavirus crisis. It's interested to capitalize on its relationship with the U.S. Like a regular U.S. president might not buy Russia oil if they drop its prices, but Trump absolutely will. And so you can count on one of the largest purchasers in the world to continue to support your economy. And you can count on Trump to continue to propagate pro-Russian propaganda, which persuades other people to buy your oil. You can solve for the internal domestic crisis of people seeing economic stagnation from the quarantine by providing them more economic development, by capitalizing on your oil reserves. And lastly, you can quell opposition parties that are rising up by weaponizing this nationalization against them and increasing your rule, the rule of Putin. For Russia's sake and for Putin's sake, we are super proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that speech and welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out today's opening half.
Can I be heard? I'm heard, okay. I am fundamentally confused by the logic of the opening government at today's debate. Because they say Russia, an exporting country of oil, when it decreases the prices, will help its economy. That is fundamentally unsound. There are two things I'll do in my speech. The first is to explain why domestically we win, and secondly, why internationally we win. So domestically, I think the first part of my extension was already built by a lot of the premises of the previous speaker, that Russia is also being hit by COVID, are losing money because the demand for their money decreases as the global economy starts to contract. This means that Russia needs a source for money. I would just want to point out that lowering your prices artificially at this particular point in time obviously reduces the amount of money you have, for the reason that all the barrels of oil that you sell have less profit margins in them themselves. But secondly, note that it's artificially, which means that it's the government subsidizing how these prices are done, so presumably you're selling it below cost. That means it is significantly more harmful for your economy because you have less money. I'm uncertain why I have to explain this right now, but given the argument coming from opening government, we are able to explain why the economy of Russia is in the problem. This proves the domestic crisis problem, right? To a degree, people are unsafe against the government right now because they're blaming the government for some of the problems. You further worsening the economy harms this. It also goes to Miko's analysis about how you piss off oligarchs. But more importantly, to a degree that Russia has been able to create its national identity on the basis of bravado and saying we can bully other countries in the world, you taking now the soft approach of being the nice guy all over the world is a really bad image change for Putin. Presumably Putin has worked by trying to say, we got to invade Crimea, we got to make the Europeans pay. To a degree that we're able to make their lives easier, that's actually harmful for your domestic concerns. So we win the issue of domestic concerns quite clearly in today's debate. International relations then. I want to divide this into three parts. First, dealing with Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. So I do not think at any point did Gov really explain the impact of why we want to deal with Saudi Arabia. Presumably they want to deal with it because they want to reduce the US hegemony in the Middle East. Even if I believe this policy harms Saudi Arabia in a way indirectly through oil, I would suggest it harms your ability to deal with Saudi Arabia to a great extent. The reason for this is Iran, who is currently being really fucked up by COVID, one of the highest cases and highest mortality rates, and therefore is very problematic, is also reliant on exporting oil. This means that lowering prices means that Iran will be forced to lower prices also, which means that you harm their ability to get money themselves. Iran is one of the closest allies of Russia, and it's necessary for them to deal with things like Yemen, which stops Saudi Arabian expansionism there, or Syria, where they fund a lot of the rebels and insurgencies. To a degree that even if we believe that Russia's economy contracts a bit, but you cripple the Iranian economy, this is a larger harm to our ability to fight against Saudi Arabia's influence in the long run. But secondly, they suggest it's a bad thing to be controlled by the international community. No, it is not always the case. I think this is generic rhetoric without real analysis. The reason as to why this is true is because Russia does have an incentive to be able to control oil prices. The reason for that is because the more oil prices you're able to control implies that you can choose the price of oil and fundamentally create how much money you want to create in an economy at a particular point in time. The problem with government is that they never explain how, absent OPEC, Russia will be able to control oil prices. They lie and tell you that Russia produces more oil than Saudi Arabia. That is fundamentally untrue. But even if you believe that, OPEC is not only about Saudi Arabia, but all the other countries. That means Russia, even if it's bigger than Saudi Arabia in comparison, is still lesser in comparison to all the other oil-producing countries like Iran, like Iraq, like Venezuela, like Sudan, and therefore all of these countries are still unlikely to cooperate with you, and to a degree you need OPEC to enter into these agreements that make you better off. So OPEC fundamentally allows you to create a cartel which allows you to inflate prices when you want to do so. Miko already provided, and I think the opening government's analysis explains why they're likely to pull out OPEC, but even if you don't believe that, because I don't think it's realistic, even if you just break the trust of the OPEC, your ability to lobby and ask them for favors later on diminishes, and therefore your ability to control prices diminishes. This argument is important because if the entire economy of Russia is contingent on oil prices, and at any point in time commodity prices fluctuate and go down, the economy can risk recession at any particular point in time. That's why control over oil prices is particularly a good thing. The second part of my speech is dealing with the US. Before I move on, is there a point from closing? I'm not. Okay, OG.
All right. Your entire case doesn't make sense. If Russia raises prices, people will buy from elsewhere and Russia will be screwed. But like we said, if we lower prices, desperate countries will go to Russia and buy it in droves during this crisis when they have no other option. They have to save money, right? Like engage with the reality that
The motion assumes that there's already an agreement, which means that all the other countries are selling at the prices of Russia right now, which means that they have no other alternative but to buy from rich high prices. But secondly, oil is not an infinite commodity. It also decreases. So at the point where they buy from other goods that will run out and therefore they're forced to buy more prices. We're not saying we have to raise prices. The op clash is we keep to the agreement. The gov clash is you decrease prices and therefore you harm the economy. So dealing with the US. So they say we are able to align ourselves with the US because Trump is pro-Russia. Firstly, I would suggest that Trump is not always pro-Russia and he flip-flops his stances at any particular point in time. Secondly, even if you believe that's true, Trump will likely lose. But lastly, I would suggest Trump is not only pro-Russia supposedly, but he's also pro-isolationist. So in the instance of Trump stays in power, it doesn't really matter his effects. But fundamentally, the more important Western actor you're dealing with is the European Union and Europe as a whole. They pose a greater existential threat to Russia because they're nearer by border. They also have greater influence over the Eastern European states, which Russia has an interest to protect because they want to create a buffer zone between them and the West. Also, the fact that the Eastern European states are far more likely to align with Europe. We are using the logic of government side, create stagflation, create recession, and create chaos in these regions. While I personally agree that's a bad thing, in the perspective of Putin, this means that people who usually trusted the European project are far more likely to be disenfranchised and blame Europe for it, blame a lot of the European Union's leaders, and therefore create a rise of populism. This does not mean that they'll always align themselves with Russia, but the fact that Europe is divided is a value in and of itself, because that means there's no united front in dealing with the Russian expansion, and therefore no small independent European country will be able to succeed. The last thing they make is, well, we're able to get a lot of other allies from smaller countries and developing countries. Okay, what are these countries? And even if I believe smaller developing countries will be able to benefit and like Russia for it, I don't get why Russia's particular interest is more important with these countries in comparison to its interest in making sure that the Eastern European bloc is protected. So even if I believe that soft power somewhat increases elsewhere, it doesn't really matter. But secondly, I would suggest the soft power is likely to be forgotten because goodness and benevolence is not always going to be repaid in perpetuity. The stronger mechanism is if you're able to force them into specific negotiations, force them into specific agreements because they're on the fact that they're not able to afford it right now, which increases our leverages in the future. So domestically and internationally, I think opposition wins this debate. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that speech and welcome the government member to open the closing half of today's debate.
Everyone hear me? I assume that's a yes because no one has said no. Cool. Starting now. I find it honestly quite shocking that a bunch of 20-year-olds in opening house know next to nothing about this motion. Look, I'm going to deliver to you three extensions today, all of which directly clash with OO, and I'd like to just make it clear that we definitely outweigh OG, which has just given us a bunch of arguments which apply to like Russia Russia making its own policies at any point in time, as opposed to this specific policy. All right, let's go into the first one, which is about why the decreasing the oil prices really hurts the US in a way that actually matters to Russia. Note that this clashes directly against the other team's characterization of Russia as needing to outlast the US and so that can make other countries see that it's weak and then everyone can ally with Russia instead. All right, what is our extension? 3 layers. First of all, let me just do some characterization of US's shale oil market because no other team seems to understand what it looks like. First thing about it, it is private, so it doesn't have significant government support. But number 2, it has incredibly high costs. That's because it extracts its oil from fracking as opposed to drilling, which is significantly more expensive, and also because it obtains the vast majority of its oil from the Arctic area, which means it has to have high transportation costs as well. Why is it significant? This is significant because because the US oil market is an incredibly fragile fragile one, which requires excellent market conditions in order to do well. Up until now, and this is the second layer, it has been doing well because demand for oil has been growing from year to year to year. So even though it has had high prices, it has been able to continue to grow and do well. The third layer is that, but at the point at which oil prices are decreasing now, then they have no way to stand up against it because there's no way for them to lower the cost of oil. What does this mean? This means that it either has to reduce production of oil or shut down entirely. Why is this so significant? Not only does it significantly harm US's economy, weakening it, which is great for Russia, but more importantly, it actually harms the US in a way that really, really matters. What is that? Because it means that because the US is currently the world's #1 producer of oil, it has actually been growing so quickly year from year to year. It's actually already outpaced Saudi Arabia and Russia, and therefore it poses a significant threat to our country, which everyone in this debate agrees depends significantly on oil. Let's weigh this against the other two. Okay. What does this mean? This means that at this point, we're able to do things such as expand our market share because the US has been moved out of the market. This means that we're able to obviously have significantly more control over the oil market. We're able to get closer towards entrenching a monopoly. Let's weigh this against the mechanism that we got on how else we beat the US. The argument about allies. Look, even if it were true that they got allies, which I don't think is true, given that allies care not only about how much you're able to outlast the coronavirus crisis, but the extent to which you're willing to help them and treat them well, but also because the US still has a huge amount of economic power elsewhere, and Russia is kind of mistrusted and isolated, and the US has a shitload of military bases. I think that the benefits of allies is still incredibly big and doesn't translate to concrete benefits, whereas we've told you why this translates to incredibly important benefits for the Russian economy. Second extension today is about why it's crucial to stand against Saudi Arabia. To be clear, okay, I think that O has given us an incredibly naive characterization of how OPEC works. They say, it's based on trust, everyone loves each other, and that trust cannot be broken ever. Look, they exist in a state of constant brinksmanship. To be fair, the reason that Russia agreed to this in the first place is because Saudi agreed to cut production in the first place is because Saudi Arabia absolutely flooded the market, forcing its hand. The OPEC is locked into a state of constant brinksmanship. For the love of God, Russia and Saudi Arabia are locked in a power struggle within the Middle East. So why does this mean that we should lower oil prices? Because for you to go along and concede to Saudi Arabia's demands just because it floods the market with oil and hurts you is a capitulation to weakness. They're saying that as long as you use force, we'll just roll over and obey you. Why is this so harmful? The first reason is that it teaches Saudi Arabia that flooding the market is incredibly effective, which is Russia can be threatened. This leads to a total loss of control over the most important market to you. But second of all, it's also incredibly important because it hurts Putin's image, which is perhaps also the most important, which is incredibly important to him. That is to say, Putin rules because he is a strongman, not because because he is a strongman, and that image of being a strongman is based on making it clear that he has the power to defend Russia's interests against foreign countries. At the point at which you're willing to roll over and sacrifice something so significant, you not only hurt the economy, you lose your legitimacy and the basis upon you base your entire reputation. I think that's the point at which oligarchs begin to abandon him. Final argument clashes really nicely with the idea about how Russia is an oil-dependent country, and therefore to lower oil prices is just a bad idea. Look, we need a bit more nuance on how this actually works, right? We live in a unique context of a crisis. That is to say, dropping oil prices is important for keeping the domestic oil-dependent industry afloat in the midst of the coronavirus. Why is this? Because Russia is currently in the stage of recovery. It is crucial that we don't have vast numbers of unemployment, layoffs, and collapse of industries that are dependent on oil, because these are things that actually face the risk of collapse. On the comparative, the Russian oil industry is relatively resistant to shocks like coronavirus. For the simple reason that it is highly tied to the state, it is also incredibly well established. There are large stores of oil, and I think that it is just and for these reasons, even if we lower prices to some extent, even if we lower prices to some extent, it is able to continue. But if you choose to increase the prices of oil, then Russia must shut down their oil production, which increases unemployment as they downsize production. This is bad, obviously, because it hurts Putin's legitimacy and also means that oligarchs lose money, but also because this just means that Putin has less of an ability to focus on external affairs because he's so busy trying to focus on making sure that Russia itself is stable. Okay, finally, let me just do some basic rebuttal of OO. So I would just like to point out that one of their key assumptions is that the price of oil is inelastic, and therefore you can raise the oil price and cause stagflation. Let me just make this very, very clear. Coronavirus does have some sort of impact on oil prices, very simply because things such as planes are no longer flying, transportation has been drastically cut down, all sorts of economies are in standstill, and therefore no more oil is being used to fund them. Therefore, this is not true. They can continuously raise oil and screw people over. On the OG characterization of Russia wanting to find allies, I just think that this outcome is so tentative and vague that there's no real way of weighing it against the existential threats that Russia has. It is incredibly important that Russia is able to solidify its grasp of the oil industry, that is why we must vote CG.
I'd like to thank the government member for that speech and welcome the opposition member to open their team's case.
Hi, can you hear?
Whip to conclude the government portion of today's debate.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay. I want to talk about three things in my speech. First of all, I want to talk about Russian economy and why it's most important and how we win on that. Secondly, I want to talk about domestic approval and how it's crucial for Russia to maintain the stance. And thirdly, I want to talk about geopolitical influence. So first clash then, let us talk about the Russian economy. We just want to know that oil right now in the status quo is the bedrock of the Russian economy. And it is clearly the thing that is projected to, that is the thing that is necessary on a path towards its economic growth. And this directly responds to CO. What I would argue right now is that empirically, oil has been shown to increase in demand moderately before the rise of Corona, right? Where it was projected to grow by 20% this year. This means that following recovery, Russia has to invest in it very heavily. What we argue then is that Putin's primary interest is massively increasing the amount of money he can milk out of the oil industry. And the best way to do that is through our extension, which is by massively increasing Russia's market share in oil. The context we told you that had absolutely no response to is that Russia's biggest competitor right now for oil is not the Middle East anymore, but it is the US fracking industry that's taking away much of the supply. But this industry is one that is uniquely fragile in the status quo for three reasons that Xiaoke gave you. First, because there's very little government support. There are very few subsidies for this industry as opposed to the Middle East and Russia. Number two, because there are high extraction costs of fracking as opposed to drilling, which means that it's only sustainable in high market conditions when the price of a barrel of Brent crude is like above $50, when right now it's at 25, so they can't sustain it. But thirdly, that we've already seen massive shutdowns thus far through the Corona attack, which means those are likely to proceed. If you raise prices on their side of the house, you allow the US market to survive. You allow them to continue being Russia's competitor and to undercut them to a massive extent. This means every long-run harm that Russia has in the oil industry is completely aggrieved by the fact that they are now knifed by the US. What is the weighing of this argument, right? The weighing is, against opening, it is indeterminate if Russia can actually beat out Saudi Arabia, but we sure as hell have a certainty in beating out the United States. And that certainty is enough, because once we beat out the US, we can already crowd out enough of the market for Russia to gain a large enough market share in order for them to have massive gains as a result of this particular policy. We don't have to win out against Saudi Arabia with a 100% certainty. What did OO then say? OO says that you break the trust of OPEC. No, we have two responses to this. The first one is they are so naive, right? Like, you can't trust OPEC because every other country in OPEC is just as two-faced as you are. For example, Saudi Arabia floods the market in response to you. For example, Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries always defect all the time. And the reason why is because, like, if you look at the game theory tree of optimality for like being a cartel, the optimal move is always to defect. So if you choose to stay, but all other countries to defect, you're just a big sucker, right? Obviously, every country is defecting no matter what. You shouldn't trust them. Number two, that OPEC can't get rid of Russia because they can't function as a cartel if they don't include the third largest oil producer in the world, which is Russia. Right. And that is why, in the past, Russia has routinely defected on agreements all the time, and OPEC can't do anything about it because Russia has such large market value that they can't just just kick them out, right? Because they kick them out, they can't determine prices anymore, even if they're like 60% of the market, because you have to be a large and disproportionate supermajority of the market in order to operate as a cartel. That crucially means all of their economic analysis fails. How does CO come into this debate? CO gives us this bizarre analysis, right? That there's going to be a pivot to renewable energy, and then therefore this is bad. The very simple response is, I would argue states pivot to renewable energy far quicker when prices are high. The reason why is because if they are comparing research into research renewable energy and comparing buying oil, they will pivot into renewable energy when they're comparably priced or when there's a better chance because of renewable energy costing less compared to oil, as opposed to if oil's low, they'll just buy it, right? Secondly, CO says that an oil war is going to hurt the economy, and the economy right now is fragile. Look, we agree the economy right now is obviously fragile, but what they didn't listen to was Schalke's analysis, which is the sector of the Russian economy that the government should focus the most on is not oil, because oil is the strongest part of Russia's fragile economy. It is the one that has the most government subsidies and status quo. What is most fragile are all the oil-dependent industries that Russia relies on, ones that have far less demand. What does this look like? It looks like airline industries. It looks like car manufacturing. It looks like manufacturing in general. All of these industries cannot survive if the price of oil is high, which means they're going to go bankrupt in the vast majority of instances. What happens on our side with a low price of oil right now means that these oil-dependent industries in Russia's domestic economy that are so important, they don't have much government backing, are able to survive to a massive extent. And that is what will allow the economy to survive in the long run, not like propping up oil, right? It's just bizarre, and oil already has so much support anyways. Second clash then. Let us talk about the idea of governmental approval. I think OG is pretty smart when they point out the idea that there's been a rise of political opposition and the fact that like there's increasing political fragility in Russia's sphere. But their solution is like silly, right? Which is like nationalism. Here's the thing, right? Oil has never been and never has been and never will be a source of national pride for Russia. So their argument about like getting everyone to congregate and to galvanize them over oil prices is just bizarre. What actually matters is Putin's strongman image. And the reason why is because in times of crises especially, this is where acts of strength are more important. This is where people look towards the leader of a country as someone who is what they should look up to. And what generally happens now is, if Russia enters the agreement of raising up oil prices, this will be seen as a massive surrender. And the reason why is because Russia literally capitulated to this agreement after Saudi Arabia flooded the market. And what this then does is make Putin look uniquely weak, because it was him who surrendered to Saudi Arabia. It was him who didn't put up a fight any longer. It is him who has now lost the confidence of the Russian people to a massive extent. So what I would argue then is you damage the ability for Putin to lead, and then you empower all his critics who say he's not fit to work. The second thing that obviously matters are workers, right? We argue you will massively increase unemployment if you go through with the ops policy for two reasons. Number one, because in order to increase oil prices, you have to decrease production. And if you decrease oil production to like shift demand leftwards, it also means you have to shut down many oil plants. This means many people who are in the oil industry become unemployed now. Number two, because of the oil-dependent industries I told you about earlier, which now are likely to go bankrupt if you have high prices of oil because they can't afford the oil anymore, those countries also fall out of the debate and therefore lose. Oil's only response to this is basically saying, oligarchs matter, right? But here's the problem. Both oligarchs are oil tycoonists. And if that's the case, and you care about pandering to oligarchs, then it would be pretty angry for oligarchs. Like, oligarchs would likely react pretty angrily if you decided to cut oil, because that's what they rely on. That's how they make their fortunes, right? So I would argue it's better on our side of the house. Finally then, geopolitical influence very clearly. What did they say? Basically, they just gave us these crackpot economics in opening up, right? Where they said that the price of oil and the demand for oil is always constant. It's always constant no matter what. This is just untrue for like millions of reasons. But I just want to note that given this is untrue, all of their arguments fall, right? Their arguments about leverage fall. Their arguments about begging countries to come to your front door to negotiate fall, because they're not going to beg at your front door when demand for oil has also drastically and correspondingly decreased. And Schalke told you this happens all the time because the people don't travel anymore. They don't buy oil for their cars. Airlines don't travel anymore. Manufacturing, it doesn't happen during the times of pandemic, which therefore means like the leverage you have on the geopolitical level is very, very small. What is crucially important here is the ability for Russia to secure their economy in the long run, to secure a large market share. We crucially do that on our side of the house, and that is why we're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the government whip for that speech and welcome the opposition whip to conclude today's debate.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay. The new oil order that is being developed by OPEC, it might single-handedly destroy most oil-reliant countries, which is why most of the countries that are in OPEC, that have economies that are largely dependent on oil, have jumped into this agreement and are going to stay loyal to it because they know that A, currently the market has very low demand for oil, but B, if renewable energy were to be able to produce sufficiently within this time, that means that most of their economies and the single biggest revenue for that economy is going to be taken away. And also note that we were also able to characterize what the current situation is like. COVID-19 was thrown around this debate, but never actually materialized into anything important. The reason why this context matters is because OPEC is in a unique position to be able to continue with the new oil order. It's not something that they could have done before because A, the excess amount of time that you now have because you don't need to regularly produce oil. But number two, the fact that a lot of the capital that would have otherwise been used into injecting the production of oil can actually be used to develop research and develop into research to actually have technology that can be energy efficient. These are things that OPEC is currently working on, and this is technology that is only going to be available to countries that stay loyal to the agreement. This is why all 14 members of OPEC are not just going to jump ship like the whip speaker suggested. This is something that they're terrified of because this future could affect them tremendously, hence why they have decided to stay. 4 things in my speech. Number 1, I'm going to tell you who best analyzed the current context and helped Putin's administration through it. Number 2, I'm going to analyze exactly what global impacts are going to be like under both sides of the house and why we best mitigate most of the damages. Thirdly, I'm going to analyze how our extension fits into this debate. Firstly, let's analyze the current context and why it's dangerous for Putin. See, here's the thing. The current agreement that OPEC has was not actually analyzed in this debate. The sole purpose of it is to create is not just to regulate price, is not just to, reduce prices, but it is also to try and find ways to make more renewable and more efficient ways of producing oil. Because the facts are as follows. There's over 30% drop in the requirement for like crude oil. Petroleum sales have dropped as well. Oil is no longer in demand in the rest of the world. What was the way in which CG decided to respond to this? They said a few things. Number 1 is that the US is still producing a lot of oil and we have to compete with them. Notice how OPEC has never made US their concern, even though they have been the largest producer of oil for the past couple of months. And the reason is simple. Trump isn't actually doing anything intelligent with this. The only reason he has allowed fracking to continue in most of these states is because he wants to try and win over fracking states in the next upcoming election. He has nothing intelligent to utilize out of this policy. If anything, all he cares about is winning the next term. He could possibly tank his economy trying to do something like that, and Russia does not need to go in the same direction. But now let's contrast this to the way in which we approach this debate. What we analyzed is what the market for oil is currently like. It is definitely low in all 3 main forms of oil. So here's what we also analyzed in this debate. Russia does not just sell its oil to every single country in the world. It has a sole target market, which is Europe, because most of Europe's oil and natural gas supply comes from Russia. And the closer you are to Russia, the more of that supply that you need. And the second thing to note here is that most of those countries are absolutely sick of it. They've tried for the longest time to find someone else to buy oil from. They don't want to be beholden to Russia, but it's just simply too convenient. Note that these are also countries with a lot of oil. So if there were ever to be a situation where renewable energy sources were developed, these countries would be the first to buy into that market, and Russia would have no share in that market whatsoever. Before that, I'll take a POI from opening.
Your extension supports our case. If the coming storm is as bad as you say it is, Russia needs to act now to capitalize on a vulnerable market, secure economic dominance, and shore itself up against the coming storm, and use the increased amount of resources it has from that dominance to like divest from oil or whatever it needs to do to survive.
No. See, the argument on dominance, which was mentioned throughout this debate, assumes that the market is going to remain as profitable for Russia following the COVID-19 crisis. Our whole extension was basically premised on the fact that currently the market is really terrible, so you'll be producing lots of oil in excess that cannot be sold. But number 2 is that you're relying on this bizarre speculation that the market is going to stay the same. In fact, the whole premise of OPEC's current agreement is to ensure that the market never stays the same and that you can move to more renewable energy sources that most of these countries are going to tap into. That is precisely why Russia cannot hedge their bets on oil for much longer. Next, let's talk about global. Let's talk about global impact. So then, next let's talk about global impact. So firstly, Putin's image. Now, note that Putin's image, as we have very clearly mentioned in our case, does not just rely on being able to temporarily lift individuals out of poverty, being able to temporarily restore the economy. Putin's image for the longest time has been someone who has protected Russia in times of crisis, but has also been someone who has brought prosperity into Russia in the long term. He has always been seen as someone who helped Russia post the collapse of the Soviet Union, which means that all eyes are going to be on Putin following this pandemic. If he were to make a step in the wrong direction for Russia's economy, that means that this entire collapse would reduce his approval rating in the country. In fact, if you look at Putin's current speech, he has literally said that Russia is no longer the same as it was. It is in big trouble, meaning to say that Putin right now is in an extremely vulnerable position. So if he were to make a mistake that could potentially harm the Russian economy and take away the entire market of oil, then he is going to be in big trouble when it comes to his image within the country. So this debate should not be judged over what he can do temporarily. Any country can bring temporary changes if they decided to let people work in factories and all of these things again. What this debate should be judged by is who can garner long-term changes, because that is the way in which Putin has been seen to help his country. And we precisely do that by allowing him to be part of an agreement that could help him tap into the renewable energy market insofar as it gets launched. Secondly, let's talk about Russia's allies in the world, because this was something that CG decided to make a big deal of. And this is a big deal, right? So firstly, they said that none of the countries, what they were trying to argue was that none of the countries in OPEC are going to be in compliance with this agreement. We've already given you plenty of reasons to suggest that they will. But secondly, note that the countries in OPEC are worth having as allies. You don't want to betray their trust, because these are oil-rich nations with lots of influence around the rest of the world. But secondly, also note that Russia's involvement in the rest of the world also relies on the fact that Russia can garner a regular stream of revenue in its economy, insofar as it chooses to not diversify and rely on a market that is going to significantly affect it as soon as this pandemic is over. That's when Russia is going to be affected in its ability to garner global influence. Here's how this extension has positioned itself in this debate. We were the only ones who were able to clarify what the true disastrous effects could be in Russia's economy following this OPEC's agreement. It is not simply to reduce oil prices, it is also to create new renewable energy resources. Insofar as they were able to succeed in this, Russia will have no share of that market, and they will lose all of their European customer base. Proud to oppose.
To thank all speakers for that debate.